He sat just a few rows away, watching in silence as they humiliated his wife, completely unaware they were humiliating the one person who could shut down their entire airline with a single phone call. The boarding gate at Terminal C buzzed with the usual rhythm of priority announcements, rolling carry-ons, and the low hum of travelers eager to claim comfort above the clouds. And among them stood Emily Carter, dressed in a simple cream sweater, dark jeans, and worn leather flats. Her hair loosely tied back as if she had no intention of impressing anyone. Yet her posture carried a quiet steadiness that most people overlooked too quickly. And that was exactly what happened when she stepped toward the first-class boarding lane, holding her ticket with calm confidence as the gate agent barely glanced at her before looking past her shoulder as if someone more appropriate might appear behind her, her fingers tightening slightly around the boarding pass as the seconds stretched, not with anger, but with something more familiar, something she had learned to carry without showing. While nearby passengers in tailored suits and polished heels moved forward without question, their status assumed before a single word was spoken. And just as Emily finally caught the agent's attention, a second staff member approached, her heels clicking sharply against the polished airport floor, her name tag reading Linda Brooks, her eyes scanning Emily from head to toe in a way that was quick but deliberate, practiced even, the kind of glance that made conclusions long before facts had a chance to speak. "Ma'am, this line is for first-class passengers only," Linda said, her tone polite on the surface but edged with something colder beneath, something that made a few nearby heads subtly turn. Sensing the shift in air, Emily blinked once, then offered a small, composed smile as she extended her ticket forward. "I understand," she replied softly. "This is my seat." But Linda didn't reach for the ticket right away, instead letting the moment hang just long enough to be noticed, just long enough for the quiet murmurs behind them to begin, just long enough for Emily to feel the weight of being measured in public without ever being asked who she really was. And still, she didn't react, her eyes steady, her shoulders relaxed, as if she had lived through moments like this before and knew exactly how they unfolded, because what no one in that terminal could see, what no one bothered to imagine, was that Emily Carter wasn't just another passenger hoping for a more comfortable flight. She was someone who had chosen simplicity in a world obsessed with appearances, someone who understood that dignity didn't need to announce itself to exist, and somewhere just beyond the glass walls overlooking the runway, a storm was quietly building, not in the sky, but in the consequences that were about to unfold. Because as Linda finally reached for that ticket, her lips pressing into a thin line, she had no idea she was standing at the edge of a moment that would change how everyone in that terminal understood respect, and not a single person watching would forget what happened next. The ticket remained in Linda Brooks's hand for a fraction longer than necessary, her eyes scanning it with a skepticism that seemed to search for something wrong rather than confirm something right. And even after the barcode was clearly marked for first-class boarding, she did not immediately step aside, instead tilting her head slightly, as if reconsidering what she was seeing. "Where did you get this ticket, ma'am?" she asked, her voice now lower but sharper, drawing a subtle ripple of attention from the passengers waiting behind Emily. And for a brief moment the steady rhythm of boarding announcements felt distant, replaced by the quiet tension forming around a single question that should not have needed to be asked. Emily's fingers relaxed at her sides as she met Linda's gaze without defensiveness. "I purchased it online, the same as anyone else," she replied calmly, her tone even, almost gentle. But Linda's lips pressed tighter, her posture stiffening as if the answer itself was not enough, as if something about Emily's presence refused to align with the expectation she had already decided was correct. And behind them, a man in a tailored navy suit shifted impatiently, glancing at his watch, while a woman in a silk blouse leaned slightly to get a better view, their curiosity feeding the moment, turning it from a private interaction into something public, something performative. "I am going to need you to step aside while we verify this," Linda continued, gesturing toward the side of the gate with a small but unmistakable motion that carried more authority than courtesy. And for a second, Emily simply stood there, not in confusion, but in quiet understanding, as if she recognized the script unfolding before anyone else did, the kind of script where appearance wrote the narrative before truth had a chance to speak. and without raising her voice, without protest, she nodded once and stepped aside, her movement graceful, deliberate, refusing to mirror the tension being directed at her. Yet the effect was immediate. The line behind her began to move again, passengers passing by with quick glances, some indifferent, others curious, a few with expressions that lingered just long enough to reveal judgment masked as observation. And still, Emily remained composed, her gaze drifting briefly toward the large windows overlooking the runway where planes taxied in slow, measured lines, each one carrying people who believed they understood where they belonged. And in that quiet pause, Linda turned slightly toward a colleague, lowering her voice just enough to suggest discretion, while ensuring it could still be heard by those closest. "We have had issues before," she murmured, the implication hanging in the air heavier than the words themselves. And that was when the atmosphere shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could be felt more than seen, because just beyond the boarding lane, a man who had been seated near the window slowly closed the leather folder resting on his lap, his expression unreadable, his attention fixed not on the crowd, but on the woman standing quietly to the side as if she had been placed there. And as he rose to his feet with unhurried precision, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, no one around him yet realized that the balance of power in that terminal had already begun to change. And the moment Linda believed she was in control was the exact moment everything had already slipped beyond her reach. The sound of polished shoes against the terminal floor was almost imperceptible at first, but it carried a rhythm that slowly cut through the low murmur of voices, and one by one, without fully understanding why, people near the boarding lane began to shift their attention toward the man now walking forward with measured calm, his presence not loud, not forceful, but unmistakably deliberate. And as he moved closer, the subtle conversations faded into a quiet awareness, the kind that settles over a room just before something significant unfolds. While Emily remained where she had been asked to stand, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, though her eyes briefly flickered toward him, not in surprise, but in quiet recognition, as if she had known this moment would come without needing to call for it. And Linda, still holding the boarding pass, had not yet turned, her attention focused on her screen as she spoke to a colleague through a headset, her voice controlled but tinged with irritation. "I just need verification. Something is not adding up," she said, though nothing in the system had actually flagged an issue. Nothing except her own certainty that something must be wrong. And that certainty was about to be tested in a way she could not anticipate, because as the man stopped just a few feet away, he did not immediately speak. He simply observed, his gaze steady, taking in the scene with a precision that suggested he was not missing a single detail. Not the way Emily had been asked to step aside, not the glances from other passengers, not the tone that had shifted from polite to dismissive. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and carried just enough authority to ripple outward without needing to rise. "Is there a reason this passenger has not been allowed to board?" he asked, and the effect was immediate. Linda turned, her professional expression already forming before she fully registered who she was addressing. "Sir, we are currently handling a verification process," she replied smoothly, but her words slowed, her confidence faltering just slightly as her eyes settled on him, taking in the tailored suit, the understated watch, the quiet confidence that did not need introduction. And for a fraction of a second, something shifted behind her gaze, not recognition yet, but the beginning of it, while the passengers nearby leaned in just enough to listen without appearing obvious, drawn by the tension that now hung in the air. And Emily, still silent, did not step forward, did not interrupt. She simply watched, her presence steady, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it, because she understood something most people in that terminal did not. That true power did not rush to defend itself. It waited. It revealed itself at the precise moment when it could no longer be ignored. And as Linda straightened slightly, attempting to regain control of the interaction, she offered a polite smile that no longer felt entirely secure. "We just need to ensure everything is in order," she added. But the man's expression did not change, his eyes remaining fixed, calm but unyielding, as if the answer had already been given and found lacking. And in that growing silence, where even the distant announcements seemed to fade into the background, The balance that had once felt so certain began to tilt, slowly, quietly, but undeniably, and no one standing. There could yet fully grasp that the moment they were witnessing was not about a boarding pass at all. It was about something far more revealing, something that would leave every person in that terminal reconsidering what they thought they understood about status, respect, and the cost of getting it wrong. The air seemed to tighten around the boarding gate as Linda Brooks straightened her posture, her professional smile now carefully reconstructed, but no longer effortless. And for the first time since the interaction began, she hesitated before speaking, her eyes flickering once more toward the man standing before her, as if trying to place something she could not quite name. "Sir, as I explained, we are simply following procedure," she said, her tone measured, though the subtle strain beneath it was beginning to show, and the man did not move, did not raise his voice. He simply extended his hand slightly toward the boarding pass still held between Linda's fingers, a silent request that carried more authority than any demand could have. And after a brief pause that felt longer than it should have, she handed it over, watching as he glanced down at it with calm precision, his expression unchanged. Yet something about the stillness of his gaze made the moment feel heavier, more deliberate, as if each second was being allowed to settle fully before the next began. And then, without looking up immediately, he asked, "What exactly needed to be verified?" And the question lingered, not accusatory, but exact, leaving no space for vague answers, while a quiet hush spread across the nearby passengers, conversations fading into silence as attention centered entirely on the exchange. And Linda shifted her weight slightly, her confidence now balancing on something less stable than before. "There was a concern regarding the validity of the ticket," she replied, though the words felt thinner now, less certain even to her own ears. And the man finally lifted his gaze, meeting hers with a calm that did not waver. "And what specifically indicated that concern?" he asked, his voice steady. And for the first time, Linda did not answer immediately, because there was no clear response that could justify what had already been set in motion. And in that brief silence, the reality of the situation began to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that could not be undone, while Emily remained just a few steps away, her presence quiet yet unwavering, her eyes steady as she watched the exchange unfold, not seeking intervention, not needing defense, because something deeper than words was already shifting in her favor. And then, almost as if grasping for control, Linda adjusted her tone, softening it slightly. "We just wanted to ensure that all first-class passengers meet the appropriate requirements," she said. But even as she spoke, the phrasing betrayed the truth beneath it, and the man's expression did not change, though a faint pause followed, the kind that allowed the weight of those words to settle fully into the space around them. And when he finally spoke again, it was quieter than before, yet somehow carried further. "Appropriate requirements," he repeated, not as a question, but as a reflection, and the silence that followed was no longer just tension, it was realization beginning to surface, slowly, undeniably, as the people nearby exchanged subtle glances. Their earlier curiosity now shifting into something closer to discomfort, because what had seemed like a routine interaction was revealing something far more telling. And as the man held the boarding pass between his fingers, his gaze moving briefly toward Emily before returning to Linda, there was a quiet certainty in his posture, a calm assurance that did not need to announce itself, because the moment for explanations had already passed, and what remained was something far more consequential, something that would not be corrected with a simple apology or a quick adjustment of tone. And though Linda had not yet fully realized it, the position she believed she held was already slipping away, replaced by a truth that was about to become impossible to ignore. And in that stillness, where even the distant sound of aircraft engines seemed to fade into the background, the entire space felt suspended on the edge of a revelation that would change everything. The silence deepened in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the terminal itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold. And Linda Brooks, still holding onto the last fragments of her authority, felt something unfamiliar press against her composure. Not fear exactly, but the quiet realization that the ground beneath her certainty was no longer steady, and the man standing before her did not rush the moment, did not fill the silence. He simply allowed it to stretch until it revealed what words could not hide. And then, with a calm that carried far more weight than volume ever could, he spoke again. "What requirements would those be?" he asked, his voice even. And this time there was no room left for deflection, no space for generalities, because the question itself demanded clarity that the situation could not provide, and Linda's eyes flickered briefly toward the surrounding passengers, aware now that every glance carried a different kind of attention, not curiosity, but scrutiny, the kind that begins to question not the person being judged, but the one doing the judging. And for a moment, she attempted to recover, straightening her shoulders, forcing a small, practiced smile. "Sir, we aim to maintain a certain standard for our premium passengers," she said. But the words sounded rehearsed, hollow against the quiet tension that filled the space, and the man tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement, as if he had just been given the exact answer he needed. And when he spoke again, it was softer, almost reflective, yet it carried a precision that cut through the air. "And that standard is based on what, exactly?" he asked. And this time, there was no immediate reply, because the truth, once brought into the open, could not be reshaped without being exposed, and the pause that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was revealing, each second pressing the unspoken reality further into the awareness of everyone watching, while Emily stood quietly to the side, her presence unchanged, her expression calm, not triumphant, not defensive, simply steady, as if she had seen this moment long before it arrived and understood that it did not require her intervention to unfold. And then, without raising his voice, without shifting his stance, the man extended the boarding pass back toward Linda, his gaze steady. "This ticket is valid," he said, a simple statement, but one that carried a finality that could not be ignored, and Linda reached for it, her hand moving more slowly now, her confidence replaced by something far more uncertain. And as her fingers closed around the paper, she hesitated, as if sensing that the interaction had already moved beyond her control. And that was when the man took a single step closer, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with a quiet assurance that altered the space between them. "And she is not just any passenger," he continued, his tone unchanged, yet the words landed with a weight that shifted the entire atmosphere, and a subtle ripple moved through the onlookers, a collective awareness that something far more significant was being revealed. And Linda's expression faltered, the last trace of her practiced composure slipping as her eyes searched his face, trying to understand what she had missed, what she had failed to recognize. And for the first time since the moment began, she looked not at Emily's clothes, not at the ticket, but at the man standing before her, truly seeing him. And in that instant, something clicked, not fully, not completely, but enough to begin unraveling the assumption she had built her authority on. And the quiet certainty in his gaze made one thing unmistakably clear: the situation was no longer about verification, it was about accountability. And as the silence settled once more, heavier than before, every person standing nearby could feel that the next words spoken would not just resolve the moment, they would redefine it entirely. The realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, almost imperceptibly, as Linda Brooks's gaze lingered just a fraction longer on the man standing before her, her mind searching through fragments of recognition that refused to fully surface. And yet something about his presence, the calm certainty in his posture, the absence of any need to prove himself, began to dismantle the assumptions she had relied on only moments ago. And when he finally spoke again, his voice remained steady, controlled, but there was a subtle shift now, not in volume, but in finality. "Her name is Emily Carter," he said, not as an introduction, but as a statement that carried meaning beyond the words themselves. And Linda's expression tightened slightly, her eyes flicking instinctively toward Emily, as if seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, not as a disruption, not as a question, but as someone whose presence had always belonged exactly where she stood. And then the man continued, his gaze unwavering. "And she is the reason this airline exists in the form it does today," he added, and the words settled into the air with a quiet weight that rippled outward, drawing a collective stillness from those within earshot. Because this was no longer an interaction about a boarding pass, it was a revelation that reframed everything that had just occurred, and Linda's composure faltered, not dramatically, not visibly enough to draw attention from afar, but in the small details, the way her grip on the boarding pass loosened, the way her shoulders shifted as if trying to adjust to a reality that no longer aligned with what she had believed, and, "I do not understand," she began, her voice softer now, lacking the sharp certainty it had carried before. But the man did not interrupt. He simply allowed her confusion to exist for a moment before answering. "You were right about one thing," he said calmly. "First class does have a standard." And the faintest pause followed, just long enough for the words to settle. "But it is not measured by appearance." And the silence that followed was no longer tense. It was absolute, the kind that settles when truth becomes unavoidable. And Linda's eyes widened slightly as the pieces began to connect, the recognition finally taking shape, not just of who he was, but of what that meant. And a subtle murmur moved through the nearby passengers, the shift in energy unmistakable now, as if the entire terminal had collectively stepped into a new understanding. While Emily remained still, her expression unchanged, her calm presence now carrying a quiet authority that had always been there, simply overlooked, and the man, still composed, still unhurried, reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a slim card, holding it between his fingers, for only a moment before presenting it, not as proof, not as validation, but as confirmation of something that no longer needed explanation. And Linda's eyes dropped to it, her breath catching almost imperceptibly as she read the name, the title, the position that transformed the entire interaction into something else entirely, something irreversible. And when she looked back up, the certainty that had once defined her demeanor was gone, replaced by the unmistakable weight of realization, because in that moment, she understood that the person she had asked to step aside was not just a passenger, not just someone entitled to a seat, but someone whose presence had never required permission to begin with. And as the silence held, deeper and more profound than before, one truth became impossible to ignore. Respect had been demanded in the wrong direction, and now, it had quietly, irrevocably, reversed. The card remained in Linda Brooks's hand longer than it should have, her fingers stiff as if they had forgotten how to move naturally, her eyes scanning the name again and again as though repetition might somehow change what it clearly stated, and yet it did not. It only deepened the realization settling into her expression, a realization that now extended beyond the man in front of her and reached back to every word she had spoken, every glance she had cast, every assumption she had allowed to guide her actions. And for the first time since the interaction began, she did not speak immediately, because there were no prepared responses for this moment, no rehearsed lines that could restore the balance she had just lost. And around them, the silence held firm, no longer curious, no longer uncertain, but heavy with awareness, as the passengers who had once watched with mild interest now stood quietly, their earlier judgments dissolving into something closer to reflection, while the man, Daniel Carter, remained composed, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if nothing about this moment required escalation, only acknowledgement. And when he finally spoke, it was not to accuse, not to reprimand, but to clarify. "You asked her to step aside," he said evenly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard without effort, and Linda nodded slightly, the movement small, almost hesitant, her voice no longer carrying authority but something far more fragile. "Yes, sir," she replied. And even as she said it, the weight of that simple admission settled into the space between them, and Daniel's gaze did not harden, it did not sharpen, it remained steady, measured, as he continued. "And you believed she did not belong here," he added, not as a question, but as a truth already established. And Linda's breath caught subtly, her eyes lowering for a brief moment before lifting again, because denying it now would not undo what had already been made visible to everyone around them. "And I was following protocol," she said, though the words lacked the confidence they once carried. And Daniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the response without accepting it as an answer. "Protocol," he repeated softly, and the word seemed to linger in the air, stripped of its protection, exposed for what it had been used to justify. And then, after a brief pause, he spoke again, his tone unchanged. but the meaning unmistakable. Protocol should never replace judgment, he said, and the statement landed not as criticism, but as something far more enduring, something that reached beyond the moment itself. And Linda stood there, her posture no longer rigid, her certainty replaced by a quiet stillness that suggested understanding had begun to take root, not forced, not demanded, but realized, and slowly, almost carefully, she extended the boarding pass back toward Emily, her movement deliberate, her voice softer than before. "Ma'am, your seat is ready for boarding," she said. The words simple, but the shift behind them unmistakable, and Emily stepped forward, her hand steady as she accepted the ticket, her expression unchanged, neither vindicated nor resentful, only calm, as if this moment had never been about proving anything, only about revealing what had already been true. And as she moved past the boarding gate, the space seemed to part naturally, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, the kind that comes too late to prevent the lesson, but just in time to understand it. And behind her, the silence remained, not empty, but full, carrying with it a quiet clarity that would linger long after the flight had departed, because in that moment, everyone present had witnessed something far more lasting than a simple correction. They had witnessed the quiet, undeniable shift of respect returning to where it had always belonged. Emily Carter walked down the jet bridge without haste, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, as though nothing extraordinary had just taken place. Yet behind her, the atmosphere she left behind continued to shift, the weight of the moment lingering in a way that no announcement or routine could erase. And inside the aircraft cabin, the soft lighting and muted tones of first-class seating created a calm contrast to the tension that had just unfolded at the gate. Flight attendants greeted passengers with polished smiles, but even here, a subtle awareness began to ripple through the crew as quiet words passed from one staff member to another, fragments of information traveling faster than any official message. And as Emily reached her seat near the front of the cabin, she paused only briefly before placing her small carry-on into the overhead compartment, her movements precise, unhurried, her presence steady in a way that required no attention, yet inevitably drew it, while a nearby passenger glanced up from his tablet, his expression shifting as recognition began to surface, not of who she was, but of what had just occurred, and a quiet respect replaced the earlier indifference, subtle but undeniable. And moments later, Daniel Carter entered the cabin, his arrival marked not by announcement, but by the way the crew's posture shifted almost instinctively, their professionalism sharpening into something more attentive, more deliberate. As he walked forward, his gaze briefly meeting Emily's, a silent exchange passing between them that required no words, only understanding, and he took his seat beside her, the space around them settling into a calm that felt earned rather than assumed. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The moment had already spoken for itself. And then, as the final passengers boarded and the cabin doors prepared to close, Linda Brooks appeared at the entrance of the aircraft, her steps slower. Now, her expression composed but no longer guarded by certainty. And as she moved down the aisle, her eyes briefly lifted toward Emily, a quiet pause in her movement, as if acknowledging something that could not be undone, but could still be understood. And when she spoke, her voice was softer, stripped of the sharp edges it once carried. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter," she said, and though the words were simple, the meaning behind them had changed completely, no longer a formality, but a recognition. And Emily inclined her head slightly, her response calm, gracious. "Thank you," she replied, her tone unchanged, not elevated by the moment, not diminished by it, simply steady, as it had always been. And as Linda continued down the aisle, the quiet transformation in her demeanor was evident, not in grand gestures, but in the small details, the way she addressed each passenger with equal attention, the way her voice carried a different kind of awareness, as if the lesson she had just learned was already shaping the way she moved forward. And when the cabin doors finally closed and the aircraft began its slow pushback from the gate, the hum of the engines building beneath the floor, there was a stillness in the front of the plane that felt different from the rest, a calm that did not come from luxury or status, but from something far more lasting, something that had been quietly restored, and as the runway lights stretched out ahead, glowing in steady lines against the early evening sky, one truth remained, unspoken yet understood by everyone who had witnessed the moment, that respect, once misplaced, has a way of finding its rightful place again, not through force, not through demand, but through the quiet clarity of being revealed at exactly the moment it can no longer be denied. The aircraft lifted gently from the runway, the steady acceleration pressing passengers back into their seats as the city lights below stretched into distant patterns of gold and white. And inside the cabin, the earlier tension had dissolved into a quiet stillness, the kind that lingers after something meaningful has already taken place, and Emily Carter sat calmly by the window, her gaze resting on the horizon where the sky deepened into soft shades of blue, her expression unchanged, as if the events at the gate had been nothing more than a passing moment. Yet the weight of it remained, not on her, but in the space around her, in the subtle shifts of those who had witnessed it. And beside her, Daniel Carter adjusted his seat slightly, his posture relaxed, his presence no longer commanding attention, but naturally holding it. And for a moment, they sat in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been understood, and a flight attendant approached quietly, her tone respectful, her movements careful, offering refreshments with a level of attentiveness that extended beyond routine service, and Emily accepted with a small nod, her gratitude simple, unspoken yet clear, and as the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into its rhythm, soft conversations resumed, glasses clinked gently, and the hum of the engines became a steady backdrop to a space that now felt different, not because of luxury, but because of awareness, because something had shifted in how people saw one another. And further down the aisle, Linda Brooks paused briefly near the galley, her hands resting lightly against the counter as she allowed herself a moment to reflect, her earlier certainty replaced by a quiet introspection that could not be ignored. And though no one spoke to her about what had happened, the lesson remained, not as a reprimand, but as something far more enduring, something that would shape every interaction that followed. And after a moment, she straightened, returning to her duties with a renewed sense of attention, her tone softer, her approach more deliberate, as if each passenger now represented something more than a seat number or a class designation. And back at the front of the cabin, Emily glanced briefly toward Daniel, her eyes calm, thoughtful, and he met her gaze with a faint, understanding smile, one that carried no pride, no satisfaction, only quiet acknowledgement. And then he spoke, his voice low, almost reflective. "You handled that exactly the way you always do," he said, and Emily's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in quiet recognition. "There was nothing to handle," she replied gently, her words simple, yet carrying a truth that resonated beyond the moment itself, because to her, dignity had never been something to defend, it had always been something to carry, regardless of who recognized it or who failed to see it. And outside the window, the clouds stretched endlessly beneath them, soft and unbroken, a reminder that perspective changes everything depending on where one stands. And as the aircraft continued its steady course through the sky, one truth remained, clear and undeniable, that respect is not granted by status, nor defined by appearance, but revealed in the way people choose to see one another when it matters most. And on that flight, in that quiet space above the world, everyone who had witnessed that moment carried with them a lesson that would not easily fade, because dignity, once revealed, has a way of reshaping everything around it. And that day, high above the ground, it did exactly that.